Welcome to the Pearson Centre Conference on New Challenges for the Canada We Want. My name is Francesca Iacorto, and I'm a director at the Pearson Centre. I'm also the Vice President of Communications and Advocacy at the Conference for Advanced Life Underwriting, CALU. I want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We pay our respect to Indigenous peoples across Canada as well as to their ancestors for their immeasurable contributions to this country. As you may know, the Pearson Centre is a leading progressive think tank that addresses the challenging economic and social issues of the day. We are very proud to say that we are the only think tank that invites representatives from all 5 federal parties, along with the top business, labor, and civil society leaders, as well as many other experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. And now a very special thank you to all our donors and sponsors that make all Pearson events possible, and particularly our sustaining sponsors that include Canada's Building Trades Unions, the International Association of Firefighters, and AMAPSEO, Ontario's professional employees. And of course, a very special thank you as well to the sponsors for this particular conference that include Baylis Medical, the Hill Times, and the Canadian Health Coalition. Now, very briefly on the format, we will have a discussion with our special guests for about 40 minutes, leaving the balance of the time to answer Q's and A's or questions for which answers will be supplied from you, the audience. So please use the question box on your screen and we will get to as many questions as we can before we wrap up promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, the theme of today's webinar is a just transition. What's involved? And to discuss it, we have with us 3 special guests with different experiences and approaches to the issue at hand. We have with us today Kim Rudd, who's a former member of Parliament, educator, and business owner. She's an entrepreneur and longtime advocate for childcare, small businesses, and post-secondary education. Kim was the past owner and president of Willis College in Cobourg and has received RBC's Canadian Woman Entrepreneur of the Year Award. She was also founding executive director of the Association of Private Colleges and vice president of the Ontario Association of Career Colleges. She is currently a consultant with the Canadian Nuclear Association. Also with us today is ISG Senator Hassan Yussuff, who is past president of the Canadian Labour Congress and one of Canada's most experienced labour leaders. He also served as president of the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, an organization uniting 48 national organizations and representing more than 55 million workers in 21 countries. And last but by no means least, we have with us today Lionel Railton, who is the director of the International Union of Operating Engineers, responsible for the oversight and support to 17 local unions serving 55,000 members. He's also the chair of the board of directors of the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum. And moderating today's session will be none other than Andrew Cardozo, who of course is the president of the Pearson Centre. So on that note, I will turn the floor over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and welcome to our guests. As you can see, Senator Hassan Yussuff is not on screen yet, and we hope that he will be. There's a technical issue. He's been trying to get on for the past while, and we hope that he will join us presently. So thank you to Lionel Railton and Kim Rudd for joining us and also being on air. So what I'm going to do is just to set the base line discussion about just transition. What I'd like to do is read a short definition of it to you, and I'll ask each of you to comment on it. I'll start with Kim Rudd. Let me just read this. So this is a quote from an NRCan, Natural Resources Canada website, and this is their definition of it, and I'll ask you to add or subtract. So the quote goes as follows. The Paris Agreement on Climate change called on signatories to take into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. Just transition involves, and they've got 3 bullets, preparing the workforce to fully participate in a low carbon economy while minimizing the impacts of labor market transitions. Identifying and supporting inclusive economic opportunity for workers, in their community.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
Go ahead, please, Kim.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here today. This topic is really top of mind for so many people. Last week was the Canadian Nuclear Association conference, and there was a panel on jobs of the future and a really good discussion on what the just transition means. And I think one of our biggest challenges on this is it's going to mean very different things to people right across the country in different sectors. We have a tendency to think of just transition mostly around the energy sector and the trades and mining and those kinds of things that are changing extremely quickly. But there also is just transition around healthcare and education and many other things. So I think that definition is fairly comprehensive. I hope it evolves as we evolve and as the situation various situations present themselves. And I look forward to talking about sort of what we need to do now on a number of fronts, but how we're preparing for the future, because there's a tendency to think about, well, we need a just transition for the workers that are working now. But what about 10 years, 20 years? What are we doing to prepare for that transition to that new economy and getting ready for that? Because it's going to be here before we know it.
Yeah. And you were there, you were in Parliament, you were Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Natural Resources. So when this discussion started, it started in terms of energy workers. Is that fair to say?
It is fair. There was, there's conversation, and there continues to be a very large conversation around oil and gas, and what those workers sort of what's that next stage for workers in the oil and gas sector. But I think one of the things we forget is that oil is not just used to burn. It is used for the clothes that we're wearing, the glasses we're wearing. It has many, many purposes that people don't necessarily, you pick up your toothbrush in the morning, you don't realize that is actually an oil product. So it's about transition to other technologies and new innovations within the energy sector and other sectors broadly. But it's also a recognition that sector is going to change, and how we provide solutions to things like extraction and refining that lower the GHG emissions, that allow those transitions and that technology to happen. So I think it's a really big conversation that has a number of arms off of it, if you will.
Yeah. Lionel Railton, you're head of the International Association of Operating Engineers. How does this issue affect your members?
Andrew, thanks very much for the question. I think it's, as Kim touched on, the low-hanging fruit that seems to be focused on right now is the oil and gas workers. And we represent a number of people that work in that sector. And these are family supporting jobs that at the end of the day is causing a lot of uncertainty for our folks that work in that industry. And what we really need to do is, we have this definition, but it's very broad. When you look at it, as Kim touched on, it's multifaceted, because not only do we support the workers in the oil and gas sector, but you got to look at the entire construction supply chain. Our roads, our bridges, the concrete we produce, the steel we produce, agriculture, which really hasn't been talked about in a great deal, will all have to transition. So what does it mean to us? Well, we have a lot of legacy industries that need support and maintenance. So we have in Canada a skills shortage currently right now. We have a number of people who are retiring out of the industry that need to be replaced. And we need to encourage the next generation to come to our industries to support the existing infrastructure. And then, as Kim has pointed out, what is it going to look like 10 to 20 years down the road? And how are we going to encourage the next generation to come and work in these sectors that need to be supported? Because these are really good paying jobs. And the noise, the white noise, as I call it in this discussion currently right now, is everywhere. And I think it really needs to be a much more focused discussion so that we can provide some certainty for people that are not only working, but considering a career in many of the industries that are going to be affected by just transition.
So can I just ask you a little more about the current workers in your sector? Who are some of the people who are going to be displaced by a move to a low carbon economy?
Well, we're currently working in the extraction industry. We're currently maintaining the refineries that produce the oil and gas. We're building new plants that produce LNG. We're working currently right now.
Sorry, we've got a lot of feedback.
There we go.
Yeah.
We have workers that are currently working on, the TMX project, the pipeline project. All of these people are potentially going to be affected at some point. And the challenge we have, Andrew, is until we get a focused communication stream that really explains to them and their families as to what their future is going to look like, it's really difficult for people to buy into just transition, because when they hear just transition, and I attend lots of these meetings across the country talking to our membership, and when they hear just transition, they hear, well, I'm just going to be transitioned out of a job. So, it's important to have the right definition. Yeah. But, construction workers, and, I'm a crane operator by trade, 30 years removed. I'd be nothing more than a hazard right now. But at the end of the day, I have to go out and talk to our membership and say to them, look, there is a future in this industry for you. It may look a little different than what it does today, but, when we go to work every day, we follow a blueprint. We're building a project. I think it's really crucial that we get to the blueprint stage and understanding what this future is going to look like and what people can expect. Because, as a crane operator, I'm a 3rd generation operating engineer and a proud father of 2 4th generation operating engineers. It's in our blood, and it's supported our families really, really well. It's allowed us to prosper in this country, and we're not unlike many of the members we represent. So to your question, how does it affect them? Currently, right now, it's just injecting a whole bunch of uncertainty. And I think you're seeing a lot of discourse in our country as a direct result of some of these discussions that are really have no path for people to look at and that they can actually follow and continue to provide for their families.
So will we see some of your workers who may be involved in building the pipeline moving into working in green energy?
Well, as we at the Canadian Building Trades say, we build it all. Yeah. So we have footprints in all the industries. So we're currently building the solar farm. We're putting together solar farms. We're erecting the wind turbines across the country. We're building, like you say, the LNG plants, all that stuff. The pipeline obviously is a really good industry. It employs a lot of people. Will those people transition? Yes, because that's just in our nature. We've been doing this for over 100+ years now. And the one thing that we understood early days is that if you don't evolve, you're just not going to exist. So, one of the, we take a great deal of pride in training our workforce. And as many may or may not know, outside of the college system, the building trades are the largest private trainer of skilled tradespeople in Canada. And one of the things that we're looking at currently right now is, what do we need to adapt and how do we adapt our particular training mechanisms to incorporate those careers of the future? Right. And I know we have a piece on that a little bit later on, but it's really crucial at this point that we be reskilling our people to ensure that they can take advantage of these new opportunities.
Yeah. Kim, you mentioned you were at the Canadian Nuclear Association conference. What are and I know you assist them as well in that field. What are the issues for the nuclear industry? I would imagine it's more people transitioning into that industry. Am I right? Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, absolutely. There was lots of discussion, certainly to Lionel's point, from the trades about, as an example, let me give you a couple of examples. So one would be the refurbishments at Darlington and Bruce Power. there is a workforce that's very transitional because the outages are staggered to refurbish the units. And each organization has their own protocols, has, you know, just, I won't say small things are different between them, but certainly they do have things that are different. And so the uptake, if you will, or the from moving from an OPG to OPG Darlington site to a Bruce site was taking a number of days, far too many days. And so it was not efficient for projects that tend to still be on time and on budget, which they are. So the unions got together with the folks at OPG and Bruce and came up with basically a protocol that if they had this, and this at OPG, then that transferred right to Bruce Power. And so what might have taken 7 or 8 days to sort of get them to where they needed to be was now taking 1 or 2 days. And so some of those things have come about organically because of a need to see more efficiencies. But there is, I'm not talking about retirement, and it's happening all over. And what does that mean? Well, it means we need some of those retired or retiring or thinking about retiring folks to do a lot of mentoring, because coming in fresh out of school is wonderful, but there's a whole lot to whatever the work is that needs to come from experience. So that mentorship program needs to be formalized. It needs to be to be identified. The other thing we talked about was the education streams. That, you know, grade 6 is really where we need to be starting. When we were talking earlier about what the future workforce looks like, we need to start them at grade 6, because if they start dropping in STEM because it's hard, they don't pick it up again. And these jobs we're talking about, whether it's in the trades, whether it's an engineer, whether it's medical, they're all going to need science, technology, engineering, and math to some degree. So statistics are showing us that there's way too much dropping early on of students. They're dropping STEM way too early. So we're cutting down the potential workforce significantly. Yeah. So that's something that needs to be addressed very much early on. But there's a, you know, Lionel talked about the uncertainty and the angst that comes from this term just transition, and I hear it all the time, and I absolutely understand it. There has to be a more formal, more, you know, governments, industry, business put tables together all of the time to look at issues. In my opinion, one of the things we need to look at are tables for these specific industries. What is it? So let's give oil and gas, where most of the angst is coming from at this very moment, and those industries that support oil and gas. So if you're able to, as an example with small modular reactors, reduce the carbon footprint, reduce the energy footprint of extracting oil in Alberta, what does that mean for the future of oil in Alberta? And what does that mean for those jobs, and what will they look like? So it's not getting rid of the oil and gas. It is finding a way for it to be done much more efficiently, effectively, in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm not saying it's panacea, it's going to be a tough go, but there need to be specific tables that involve industry, government, the trades, businesses, supply chains, all looking at what do we have today, and what's the timeline, what's a roadmap look like to 2030, 2035, and 2050. And then I think we can start having the conversation about what those things we need to insert along the way look like, and take some of those angst. I don't know about you, but if there's a plan that people could see themselves in, then it's positive, there's hope. But if there's nothing but words out there, and some of them not very comforting, I think we cause some of this angst ourselves.
Andrew,
Yeah, Andrew.
I can hear you, but I can't. Of course, the camera is not working for a variety of reasons. But I've been listening to your conversation, so whenever I just wanted to at least bring you up to speed.
Okay, so I'll just, if I can just interrupt 1 second, I just want to tell the audience this is Senator Hassan Yussuff, who is.
I think I lost you there in terms of the
Andrew,
last part of you.
Andrew,
you cut out there, Andrew. Either you're muted or there you go. I could heir you now.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm just telling the audience it's Senator Hassan Yussuff who's joining us, audio but not visual. So we'll take 1 out of 2 ain't bad. And Senator, please go ahead. I'm glad you joined us.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for doing this. I think it's really an important conversation for the country to be having, but equally for policymakers to be more appreciative of the need to get this right in regard to the discussions going on, both at the federal level, but also at the provincial level. So I think it's really important timeliness in terms of what needs to be done. I think you started off with the very basic question in regard to the UN definition and the Paris Agreement. I think for the most part, I could say, yes, I agree with part of their definition, but I think we need to go back a little bit farther than that. The whole principle of just transition came as a result of workers saying that we understand that from time to time there are disruptions in the nature of work that we're doing in society, and if you're going to displace us as a result of public policy or decisions that are made by our elected officials, there need to be some recognition that workers need to be taken care of. And the way you take care of workers, not just to say, we're going to take care of you, you actually put together programs that are going to give some justice to their, obviously their needs, but equally recognizing the impact that those disruptions are going to have on community and how you adapt it to basic principles, not just the worker, but also recognizing the community also need to be brought into this conversation. But more importantly, both governments and employers and workers need to be part of this discussion in the broader scale. So the principle, I think, has been to a large extent been accepted. Their debate as to how specific we can get to its meaning, but I think there is enough I guess, language out there now that give government some guidance, because they have to provide the leadership to ensure that the sectors are going to be impacted in just transition. We have a clear understanding what that means for the workers and the community that will be impacted by these decisions.
And what do you think? What do you think needs to happen next? Is there enough convening going on between government, labor, and business, or is this more just general principles being enunciated?
Well, I think there's 2 things that need to be said. One, the government did put together a task force to look at the phase out of the coal, phase out of coal by 2030. And the work of that task force was to lay the groundwork, of course, how we can deal with the phase out of coal and the workers and the community be impacted. And that task force that lay out some very broad recommendations that the government should follow. Some of that to some degree have been followed, but not, of course, in a consistent way across the country, and every community has been impacted. We can learn from that experience. Of course, more importantly, I think what we need the federal government to do, recognizing, of course, it is public policy that is driving this ambition of our government. We need, of course, to have some legislative framework to provide some guarantee for workers, and more importantly for the community, how we're going to deal with this in a systematic way that will give, of course, both employers, unions, of course, and provincial and federal government, how we can work together to ensure that, the needs of workers will be taken care of, because many of the workers are going to be impacted by, both oil and gas, but also in the coal transition. Some will want to retire. Some, of course, are not ready to retire, so they want to continue to work. So we need to figure out what those workers might need in terms of skills upgrading or adapting to other employment that might be there. And more importantly, how do we ensure we're giving them the support they need, but at the same time, recognizing the impact that will come to the communities who, of course, are losing the tax base on these industries, of course, as they change. Right. How do we support those communities? Because workers don't live in other places. They live in the place close to where they work. So given the impact that's going to take place, how do we ensure we also have some support for the community so they can attract other businesses and investment, so they can create meaningful jobs for workers that, of course, in the community will be sustainable in the near future?
Okay, thank you for that. And I have a question that I had later on, and a similar one has just come in from the audience. So I'll ask all of you to comment on this. And the question goes, what kind of legislation, especially at the federal level, is needed to ensure effective, just transition? And maybe I'll start with you, Lionel, and then I'll ask him, and Senator, I'll ask you third. So Lionel, please go ahead.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you for that. You know, the federal government has set the table with respect to emissions reduction. So the responsibility comes with them to pass the necessary legislation that people are not going to be left behind. So at this point, I understand they're in the process of drafting legislation, Just Transition Act. I understand that's underway. That work is being done through our consultations with government. That's taking place, and we're hopeful that you know, through all of those consultations, that legislation will reflect the discussions that have taken place and will continue to take place. I think it's crucial that, you know, it's simple. No worker should be left behind as a direct result. All workers should be given the opportunity to at least reskill or have supports put in place, as Hassan's already pointed out, for them, their families, and their communities. So if you set the table on the emissions reductions, then obviously you have to accept the responsibility that comes along with that. And I know this government's working hard on that.
Yeah, good, thanks. Kim Rudd, I'll ask you as a former parliamentarian, what do you think is playing on the government's mind at this point, and what do they need to put in that legislation? Sorry, you're on mute.
There we go.
Yeah,
I think there's a couple of things. One, to the senator's point about sort of no worker left behind, the impact on communities, all of that obviously needs to be considered. I think, you know, from the government's perspective, I think there is the commitment, a very strong commitment to 2030, 2035, and to net zero 2050. So while certainly the just transition must include taking care of those workers who may not fit, if you will, into the next stage of whatever this looks like, there's also a recognition that they need those workers to make it to 2030, 2035, and 2050. They don't get there without a workforce. It is one of the biggest challenges we have right now. So the just transition legislation, as Lionel said, is being worked on right now. And I hope out of that come the tables and the discussions and the roadmap, if you will, that get us in each sector where we need to be. But the reality is there is a huge impetus for the government to have just transition be robust, because it is going to be the next stage of our workforce. So whether that means training, whether that means you know, on an individual basis, whether that means helping universities, colleges, the apprenticeship programs scale up, understand what those next worlds of work, if you will, look like, so that their curriculum is. I came from the private college sector, as you know, you said in the introduction, and we could make changes through the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities fairly quickly with our programs. Universities can take years, and so we need to be doing that right now. And so I think that there is I think that this is a very important piece of legislation for the government, and I think that they're sort of going all in on it for a variety of reasons.
So Kim, does this have to happen through the provinces because colleges are under the jurisdiction of the provinces, or which then gets, you know, 10 different provinces have to do that?
Some of it.
Or can it happen from the federal government talking to the colleges?
Well, the federal government and the universities are more in line, because universities come under federal sort of bucket, if you will. But certainly the trades and the colleges are primarily under the provinces. But the provinces have already identified what a number of their own sort of challenges will be with just transition. So I envision a collaborative effort between the federal government and the provinces. So if it's province, I won't say a name because I could be wrong, but let's say province A sees particular their work, they need support for X, Y, Z, then that's an agreement between the federal government and the provincial government in terms of funding specifically towards that province. It won't be the same across the country. I mean, this transition is so big and it means so many different things in so many places. One of the examples that one of the folks gave us last weekend was on the Prince Edward Island Bridge. So there were ferry workers and people who ran the boats and managed those ports, et cetera, et cetera. And when the bridge was put in, they saw themselves out of a job. And they were able to train and retrain folks to be able to manage and operate the bridge. But I don't think any of us really thought, well, yeah, they're putting the bridge in, that's more efficient. But what happened to those workers who were running those boats? So I think every province will look very differently, but there's I think that there's goodwill between the feds and the provinces and territories on this for sure.
Yeah. Senator, what needs to be in the legislation for you to support it, for you to vote for it when it comes to the Senate?
Well, I think there's a number of things that I think has already been pointed out in the coal task force recommendation, that hopefully the government do look at the task force recommendation as a starting point. But more importantly, I think it's critical that the government recognize there will need to be support for workers through income support while they're going through either upgrading their skills or retraining. Some may need, of course, other support. They may not have a job in the community in which they currently reside. They might have to pack up and move someplace else. The government needs to provide assistance for those workers to be able to move from their community to someplace else should they require that. I think also, too, for some older workers who might need a bridge to their retirement because there may not be enough time for them to retire. How do we ensure those workers can have a decent retirement without having to pay the penalty for the fact that they can't see their retirement with the same employer they're currently working with? In addition to that, I think there have to be a table for employers and workers and government to sit together to talk about how we could sort of look towards what the timing is for the transition to happen and work backward. If you got 5 or 10 years to, of course, for workers to achieve this objective, the most basic things you'd want to do, okay, what are some of the responsibilities that employers should have to meet, given these workers have helped them run their businesses and made it quite profitable. They do have some obligation. If the workers need retraining and some upgrading skills, they've got some time to do that while they're still with that employer. Secondly, of course, I think it's critical for the government to recognize that this is a public policy objective, and workers are very important part, of course, of us meeting our climate achievement in 2030, but also in 2050. And if you want to build their involvement in this, I think you have to give them the space where they can speak for themselves. I think one of the points has been made earlier is not every community needed to be treated the same. While the legislation should, of course, have the basic mechanics of how we will ensure workers will be taken care of, X and Y community may not need the same degree of support. So how do you differentiate between one and the other? But more critically, I think there's a recognition that their employers have an important role and responsibility to these workers. The provincial government have an important role. I think has been, Kim indicated that what the role of province. I have to say, as we went through the coal task force, only one province really played a significant role in how coal workers were being transitioned. That was initially in the previous Alberta government recognized that they had to step up because nobody was stepping up at the time. But in terms of Saskatchewan and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, those provinces were not, of course, showing the leadership that should be brought to the table to recognize they need to also play an important role working with the federal government. After all, these targets that we're setting quite often is agreed to both the provinces and federal government. They don't come out of thin air. but yet there's an expectation only the federal government have to step up. I think it's wrong. I think the province got an important role to play here, and they need to be at the table to participate in a meaningful discussion if we're going to achieve the objective at the end of the day. What we don't want to see, of course, is workers feeling that the only way they're going to get attention, of course, they have to rebel against the system. We need to achieve our climate objective, but we can't do that in a way where workers become the victim of our objective without us taking them into the consideration how to build a better and a brighter future going forward.
Thank you. And Kim, can I ask you, in your experience with the nuclear industry and working with the employers, what do they see as their responsibility? What do employers see as their responsibility? You'll have to unmute.
Again, there we go.
Thank you for muting, because it's reducing the feedback.
So employers in the nuclear sector absolutely see themselves as part of this just transition because they are, the technology is moving forward, the new nuclear, the SMRs, there's a number of things, and supply chain. I mean, 76,000 jobs in Canada in this sort of group. So they're experiencing the same thing every other sector is, which is an aging workforce, work that needs to get done, and attracting folks into their sector and finding ways to do that. They also see because of that, they see an opportunity in sectors that are finding themselves in a transitional phase the other way, that they have an opportunity to attract those folks. So if we have a sector that is transitioning down, if you will, the nuclear sector sees that as an opportunity to transition them up into the nuclear sector. And so there's active work going on, especially with the trade unions, et cetera, et cetera. And, I'm in Ontario, the auto sector is a perfect example. We're now going to be building electric vehicles, which take a different skill set in lots of ways than the combustion engine. And so what does that look like, and how are we retraining those folks, and what does that batteries? We've never created batteries on this kind of a scale. What does that look like? Where are those workers coming from? So I think, in my experience, pretty well every sector that is in the, including the oil and gas sector, which is moving technology forward, everyone's looking for the best of the best, if you will, and finding ways to retain and advance workers. And it will mean helping them financially, as the senator pointed out, financially with supports for training, possibly relocation, all of those things. So I don't see it just as a federal government or provincial. I see the industry and the unions will play a huge part in that whole process of whatever it looks like in different communities across the country.
Yeah. So Lionel, let me ask you, what is the role of the labor unions in just transition? You mentioned a few things that you're doing. I wonder if you could just encapsulate that.
Sure. Yeah. No, Andrew, and just quickly on the nuclear side, because we're deeply involved in that, just to amplify it a little bit, just before I move into your question. Sure. We need it all. I mean, this thing that people, I think, have some appreciation for, but I don't think they truly understand the depth. We're going to need nuclear. We're going to need a much more robust transmission system, electrical transmission system. We need to upgrade our grid. We're going to electrify all the cars. We currently don't have the proper infrastructure in place to allow for all of that. So, we're going to need it all. So, the skilled workforce is obviously going to be critical. What are we doing as a trade union? What is labor doing? Positioning ourselves? Well, obviously, we're talking to government. We're playing a consulting role with respect to what we're hearing from our men and women and passing those messages on so that we can hopefully alleviate some of the uncertainty and the angst that's currently out there right now. The other piece of it is we're retooling our training facilities and looking forward over the next 5 or 10 years. The government has been helpful in that regard with respect to supplying funding through the UTIP program, the Union Innovative Training Program, which has allowed us to upscale our fleets and our training methods. We're taking advantage of the innovation piece of it as well to look forward and do the research as to where these jobs are going to be in the next 10 to 20 years. The other piece of it is we're looking at how we can utilize some of the existing technologies and use things like carbon capture in the oil and gas sector to reduce the footprint, much to Kim's point. The other piece of it is hydrogen is going to play a big role in our society going forward as a fuel, a clean fuel. You can't have hydrogen unless you get the next generation of nuclear, because you need the high quality heat and steam that comes along with that, because you can't burn fossil fuels to produce hydrogen because you just increase the footprint. So when you look at all of the technologies that are available to us and the workforce of the future, we have to understand where, using Kim's phrase, the roadmap, get that roadmap in place, and then we can start encouraging people to come and partake in these well-paying and family-supporting careers. But we need it all. If we want the lifestyle that we have currently today, we're going to have to do all of these things in tandem. And it's not a matter of picking one over another. It all has to come together. So I think there's lots of opportunity. That's really what I've been saying to our membership and anybody that wants to listen is, yes, I understand the certain uncertainty that you're hearing out there with all of the white noise that's going on and the politics that are being played around this particular issue. But really, there is lots of opportunity. There's some really good paying jobs that are coming. There's going to be, I suspect, a fair amount of funding that's going to be allocated to allow people to upskill or just join the workforce in general. You know, we hear we have a labor shortage, but frankly, I don't agree with that. We have a skill shortage, and there's lots of people in the labor force that we could upskill and reskill and invite them to come and partake in our industries, and they'll have really good paying jobs. You know, we've got young people coming right out of high school that get paid to train in the apprenticeship program and then are earning a 6-figure income, you know, within 4 years of starting their apprenticeship. So not too bad when, you know, if you want to buy a house in this challenging markets and you want to buy that new electric car, there's lots of really good opportunities there for those that want to take on the challenge.
Lionel, can I just go on a slight tangent, but very much related to what you've just said, which is the issue of nuclear. There's always been a certain amount of resistance to nuclear energy and nuclear power plants and all that. I think most Ontarians probably don't know that 60% of their energy comes from nuclear in Ontario. What's your response to people who have concerns about nuclear energy?
Well, the thing that people don't understand in Canada, the Canadian regulatory system is the most robust in the world. We are leaders in the nuclear industry. You know, we've quietly done it. We've built up an entire industry around nuclear. You know, Kim mentioned Darlington and Bruce. I mean, the largest construction projects that are going on in this country right now are at Darlington and Bruce. They're 12 billion and 13 billion respectively. And what I say to people with respect to nuclear is, you're right, Andrew. When you flip your switch on in the morning in Ontario, that power that's powering your lights and heating your hot water, at the end of the day, is probably coming from a nuclear plant, and people don't really understand that. So I think we need to do a better job of educating people as to what nuclear can do. If we want to develop the North and get the North off diesel, we've got to look at nuclear as an option. These new small modular reactors are small enough. They can be built in a factory. They have the security protocols that are in place that allow them to exist, empower communities and get them off diesel and allow them to evolve and prosper like the rest of us. So, you know, we're passionate about SMRs. Technology has been around for a long time. Everybody's saying this is new technology. Frankly, it's not. It's been around for 30 or 40 years. It has safety mechanisms built, and a lot of the small modular reactors were actually developed as a result of the powering of nuclear submarines. So you fuel these, unlike the CANDUs that need to be fueled every day, these small modular reactors can be fueled. They'll run for 20 years without having to be refueled, and then you can reconstitute the fuel. So it solves part of the problems around nuclear and the fact that they are safe, and most importantly, they reduce the waste factor that come out of the CANDUs. which is really why people are resistant with respect to nuclear waste, is really around the waste sector.
Comment from you, Kim Rudd, if you can just unmute. So
there we go. The control room and I are fighting with the mute button. Just to add to that, there is this perception that there are people who have, there are a number of people who have a lot of hesitancy around nuclear. And what's really interesting over the past few years are the reports that have come out that said we can't get to net zero 2050 without nuclear. And a number of those folks who were hesitant have taken a new view of nuclear, taken another look at it, and recognize that some of the old stories from 10, 15, 20 years, or their beliefs, aren't actually the case. And so we've seen a number of folks that have who have come to a realization that the environment is the most important thing, getting to net zero 2050 is the most important thing, and the IAEA clearly says we don't get there without nuclear. So I think that there is a bit of a, I won't say a sea change, but I think there is certainly a change happening because of the climate crisis that we're faced with.
Okay, Senator, I want to ask you about the transition task force that you co-chaired on coal. A lot of our discussion here has been about what needs to happen going forward, but I'm thinking your report is now a couple of years old. To what extent has that been implemented, and to what extent are labor and business involved in discussions about transition?
Well, the process is evolving, I would say. Saskatchewan is now in the forefront, having to meet its time frame. Will be 2030 will be here fairly soon, so they have now got to make the leap as how they're going to get to the phase out of their coal generation facility within that time frame. Subsequently, of course, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, of course, is also in the same boat. They, of course, have likely to have the opportunity to gain power from, of course, from Newfoundland and Labrador with their Lower Churchill project coming on stream. But the reality is, of course, it's been a real challenge with getting both the provincial and the employers to get on side to recognize that they need to take some responsibility regarding the transition. Certainly at the federal level, they had put aside money that the communities have been accessing to use for transition centers, and looking at other businesses and development that could happen in their community to replace some of these jobs. That's already much farther ahead in Alberta, because the coal phase out already happened. The first phase of it, the plants, some of them that still have a shelf life, went from coal to natural gas. They're using less people, of course, in natural gas generation, but they completely stopped using coal. So some of the coal mines are already closing or in the process of closing. But it's been a hit and a miss. And of course, when you don't get the province to play the same role with the federal government and bring the employers on side, it become a disjointed relationship as how you're going to manage the transition. That's the last thing we need. We need, of course, symmetry, where people to be working with each other, recognize they all got an important role to play. And that's been a bit of a problem. Of course, the federal government, for the most part, except for Alberta, has put up the bulk of the resources there. In Alberta, the provincial government did put up some resources with the previous government, and that's been used very effectively. I think we need the Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick government to put up resources to match a federal government contribution, but also to work with the workers and the communities as to how we are going to meet the objective by now in 2030, because it's really critical for these workplaces going to be impacted within that time. But so it's a work in progress. I think there's much to learn. I think there's a lot of communities who have taken the task force and use it for what it's worth, recognizing they've got a central role. And I think the local government has actually been playing the most important role, both in Saskatchewan and other places, in regard to recognizing that they need to get ahead of this challenge that is coming by 2030.
So is this a good role model, the system that's happened with coal? Is that a good role model for other sectors as well?
Well, I think it was a good model in the sense that, given what the province and the federal government have decided that they would phase out coal by 2030, was to give workers the opportunity and municipality and others a chance to go out and talk to those workers going to be impacted as to what would you like to see if we were able to put together a report that will reflect your concerns, your challenges going forward. So the report is a reflection of what we heard and, of course, what people would like to see happen. The implementation regarding those recommendations has always been a challenge, and of course, it takes partnership to make that happen. The partnership has not been as smooth as one would expect, and I think that's where we see a huge challenge. I'm hoping with, of course, oil and gas and other sectors that will come on stream as they will deal with transition, there's a better understanding and a need for us to get those partnership together up front. Lionel spoke to the fact that they're engaged seriously, talk with the federal government what the legislation should look like. I think in the legislation, there has to be some commitment for employers to play a significant role, as they are for the provinces to play a significant role. If we have those three pieces together, I think, of course, transition will be, of course, a wonderful experience for workers in the long run. If we don't have them, we'll be a disjointed, I think, a challenge. And of course, as a labor movement, workers will continue to push and fight for what they see as necessary. But I think it's much easier if we're working together to try to achieve those objectives.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. There was a question about STEM. Kim Rudd, you had mentioned the decreasing number of people who are young people who are studying STEM. I just wonder if you got a quick comment on that, and then I have a question for all of you as a closing comment. But just a quick thought on how we can turn that tide around in terms of getting more people to study.
Well, good question, and a big one, actually, because it is, like I said, grade 6, from what I understand, is the age where we need to start talking to kids about how important STEM is for their future. And I think sometimes, kids hear the word algebra, math, calculus, and their eyes glaze over. And there is there's a huge value in making sure that kids understand that putting in the work when they're in high school and into college and university is worth it at the end, when you can see some of those jobs Lionel was talking about, and other jobs that will be the jobs going to the future. So STEM is increasingly important, and we have to make sure it's even more attractive to kids as they start going through the education system.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So in terms of a closing question, this is what I want to ask you. We have a webinar next week with the Labour Minister, Seamus O'Regan, and I wonder if you could help us write the questions we should be doing with him next week. So what does he need to do? He's playing a leading role in the government's movement on just transition. I'll start with Lionel, then Kim Rudd, and then Senator Hassan Yussuff. So Lionel Railton, your thought about what the government should be doing, what Seamus O'Regan needs to know.
Yeah, Minister O'Regan and Minister Wilkinson have been very good on their outreach to date with respect to labor. We've attended 3 sessions at this point. I think Seamus has been very good about saying that this will be labor-led. So I think it's really important that he stay on that tact and ensure that labor has the voice at the table, and he doesn't vary from that particular position, because long and the short of it, as Kim has already pointed out, without a skilled workforce to take this on, we're just not going to achieve the emissions goals at the end of the day.
Thank you. Kim Rudd, your question for Minister O'Regan.
Well, Seamus is one of my favorite people. He's one of the most passionate people, no matter what file he's holding. We saw that in NRCan. We're seeing it in labor. And the Bay du Nord project that just got approved in Newfoundland, Seamus talked a lot about just transition when that project was announced. So for Seamus, the question I think becomes, what is the roadmap? I think that's the question. What's the roadmap to get where we all know we need to be? And he will find the humor in that because this SMR roadmap was under my term as the parliamentary secretary. So he will see the humor in my question.
Good, good. We like to have humor in these weighty policy issues, and I think it's also a requirement when you're talking to a minister of Newfoundland, where levels of humor are far more sophisticated than the rest of the country. Senator, your last word to you. What are the questions we should be asking Minister O'Regan?
Well, I think everybody's wanting to know when the government is going to be tabling a just transition piece of legislation. And more importantly, did they hear the conversations that has been happening as to what workers would like to see in that? The other point I would make is that critical for Seamus, but also for the government, is that bringing forth the piece of legislation, given the number of ministries that this legislation will cross in the government in terms of the policy objective, there has to be one minister as the lead minister to continue to coordinate among those other ministries. Otherwise, nobody is in charge. You can't have the environment, natural resources, labor, and of course, human resources, HRSDC, not coordinated through one minister playing a leading role, because the pieces that will require to make this a success, all those ministers have an important role to play, but one minister should be the lead role on behalf of workers and the community that will be impacted by this. So I'm hoping at the end of the day, they will lay that out in their legislation that gives some clear direction as to which minister would play the leading role in coordinating all of these different aspects and pieces of it. But ultimately, what I would like to see him is to give us a time frame when he will table the legislation, so at least we can dive into it and hopefully see what's missing, and hopefully they'll get it fixed before it passes Parliament to get to the Senate.
Yeah. Otherwise you will raise hell in the Senate and make sure it happens.
You can guarantee that for sure.
Good stuff. Okay, before I just say goodbye to you, I just want to remind our audience that for the course of our conference in the next few days, we have a session tomorrow, which will look at the Conservative race and the future of the conservatism in Canada with Tasha Sheridan and Monty Solberg. On the 22nd, on Friday, which is the 125th anniversary, the 125th birthday of Lester B. Pearson, we have a session with Senator Landon Pearson and Bob Ray, Ambassador Bob Ray, talking about Pearson's legacy then and now. We've got several sessions next week. The one I will mention, though, is our discussion with Minister Seamus O'Regan, Minister of Labour, on the 28th. Please keep in touch with our website. These are the sessions we've got this week and next week, which are the remaining 2 weeks of our conference on the new challenges. So certainly the new challenge we'll be talking about is how to do just transition well. I want to thank you very much, Senator Hassan Yussuff, Kim Rudd, and Lionel. Thank you for your time and explaining these issues so well, and of course for the work you're doing for Canadians out there. So thanks so much. And,
thank you. All the best. Take care.
Take care.